Howdy, folks. Welcome to the American Prospects YouTube channel. A few weeks ago, I did my taxes. As it is for many of you, I would guess it was a huge hassle. I've got a job and a wife and a kid and several sources of income, and figuring out how to enter all that info in the various forms was an annoying pain in the neck that took hours. Then I had to pay one of those online services a bit of money to file my return at both the state and local level. I guess that probably I messed up something or other. Many countries make this a lot easier with simplified tax filing. In countries like the Netherlands, the government sends most people a completed tax return and you just have to check it over for mistakes. Most of the time, the tax authority gets it right, but if you want to dispute their numbers, you can file your own return. But what if I told you that there was another option in which the vast majority of people wouldn't have to file their taxes at all? What if I told you there is an option where the government tax authority is so good that most people don't even have to think about taxes ever? What if I told you that such a system provides all manner of conveniences for individuals, businesses, and the government itself? What if I told you that such a place actually exists today, hidden in the remote North Atlantic? Well, that's simply the truth. If you want the best tax system in the world, you've got to travel to the Faroe Islands, remote country out in the ocean between Scotland and Iceland. And that's just what I did myself a couple years back. But wait, what are the Faroes? They're a peculiar, semi-independent former colony of Denmark with a population of about 54,000, kind of like Greenland. They have representation in the Danish parliament, in fact a slight overrepresentation, and all Faroese are Danish citizens, but the Faroes are not part of the European Union, mostly run their own welfare state, and have their own foreign policy. They've negotiated independent fishing treaties with neighboring countries, for instance. They're also one of the richest countries in the world, even a bit richer than Denmark itself, which itself is actually a bit ahead of the US in terms of GDP per hour worked. The Faroes are one of the most beautiful places I've ever visited, and I instantly fell in love with the place. It's got a certain rugged, dangerous beauty that spoke to me. It's full of wacky history, too, like this naked statue referencing a local legend of seals that turned into women. The land is impossibly gorgeous, with fjords, brilliant green hills, and spectacular cliffs everywhere you look. One particularly remote promontory was used as a setting for the villain's lair in the most recent James Bond movie. In celebration, the government set up a gravestone carved by a local stonemason at the site in the film where, spoiler alert, Bond supposedly dies. But it's a harsh beauty. When I hiked up to visit the grave marker near the famous Kálur lighthouse, the views were spectacular, but the relentless wind felt like it could easily carry me off one of the 100-foot cliffs on every side. On another trek out to a famous local waterfall, I later learned that a Chinese woman out hiking with her husband had disappeared on that same trail, almost certainly because she fell into the ocean. After days of searching, authorities gave her up for dead. But the Faroese tax system is also beautiful in its own way. It's unique even among their Nordic neighbors, and probably the best in the world. Its operating principles are centralization, efficiency, and simplicity. It's not the most riveting subject for a travel holiday, but it's beautiful in its own way, and it makes a major difference in the lives of every Faroese person, from the lowest worker to the owners of the biggest businesses. It's hard to imagine fully implementing such a system in the United States, but we still might learn from their example. But first, let me discuss the Faroese economy. The islands are way out in the North Atlantic, 180 miles from the Shetland Islands on one side and 400 miles from Iceland on the other, with a small population. So how is this isolated, rugged place so wealthy? It turns out that the Faroes have turned fish into a cutting-edge economic engine. First, some of the world's most sophisticated fishing operations make big money catching pelagic fish like mackerel, blue whiting, and herring. A smaller sector catches demersal, that is bottom-feeding fish like cod and haddock. Second, an even more sophisticated aquaculture industry has grown up in the Faroese fjords. largely farming salmon from eggs to fry to fully grown fish in a way that avoids disease, parasites, and excessive pollution. That's created a secondary industry of subcontractors and support firms, which also export a lot of their services and machinery. As a result, salmon alone accounts for 45% of Faroese exports. To protect the golden herring, the Faroese government has implemented both internal quotas and trade agreements to prevent overfishing. No one wants a repeat of the drastic collapse of catches in the mid-1990s, which triggered off an economic crisis and caused the Faroese population to shrink by about 10% in just a few years. The crisis also motivated the establishment of a national bank, which handles the issuance of government debt, monitors financial risks, and maintains a rainy day investment portfolio equal to 15% of GDP. Not for the first time, I was struck by the contrast of the Faroes' cautious economic diligence compared to slapdash American governance. If the U.S. established such an account, it would have about $3.5 trillion in it. The overall Faroese economy is frankly bursting with prosperity. Unemployment has been below 4% since 2015, below 2% since 2019, and currently sits at a mind-boggling 1.1%. Employers are so desperate for workers that immigrant laborers from all over the world are common. I met a friendly Polish bartender named Mateusz who had actually been recruited from Iceland. The Faroes' income inequality is the lowest in the world. Its Gini index, where 0 would be perfect equality and 1 all income going to one person, is 0.21, below even the other Nordics and far, far below the American figure of 0.49. So that finally brings me to the Faroes' exceptionally sleek and efficient tax system. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention the tax authority itself is called, confusingly, tax, T-A-K-S. One way to start to appreciate the magnificence of tax is by thinking of how we do it here in America. Imagine you run a medium-sized business with a few dozen employees. You're legally required to send your workers' payroll and income taxes to the government, so you hire a payroll processor like ADP or QuickBooks to handle that for you, along with employer-sponsored insurance and other benefits. It costs something like $50 per month per employee, and you have to go through an annoying onboarding process every time you hire someone. Or imagine you're one of those employees. At the very least, you've got to file a bunch of obnoxious paperwork to the IRS every year. If you make much money at all, it's advisable to keep track along the way of everything that might be eligible for some tax deduction. Your mortgage interest, child care expenses, commuting costs, and so on. And enter it all correctly come tax day. It gets worse if you have a side job. Your two bosses don't talk to each other, so they don't withhold the correct amount of tax from your combined income. You've got to figure out what you owe and instruct one or the other job, or both, to withhold more money, or send quarterly payments to the IRS, or sort it out when you file your tax return and potentially pay a penalty for underpaying. This all adds up to an enormous burden on the American people and our economy. Filing taxes takes up an estimated 6.5 billion hours each year. As the Conservative Tax Foundation points out, the equivalent of 3.1 million people working full-time for the whole year. Assuming average wages for the type of work involved, that adds up to a $313 billion burden on the economy. In terms of actual business, the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that there are over 83,000 tax preparers making an average income of more than $50,000. Payroll processing is also a big business. I sat down at the tax office with Director Eyun Mokura and its head of communications, Diana Gilstone, who explained how Faroese businesses and workers faced about as little of this kind of hassle and expense as could be imagined. Here, all ordinary wage transactions are processed through a central government system, and tax automatically takes out whatever it estimates you owe before the money is deposited in your bank account, along with any welfare payments like family or unemployment benefits, pension payments, and so on. Self-employed people and businesses do have to file tax returns, but this can't be avoided. The Faroes also have an exceptionally clean tax code with no deductions of any kind for ordinary employment income. A simple tax code, of course, is easier to administer, and Eyun does his best to keep it that way. If the politicians are trying to make some changes, I try to defend my tax system. Don't do it that way, do it another way, he told me. The point isn't to tell the government what kinds of policies it should do, but to urge them to be done in the most efficient manner. He pointed to a commuter benefit run by tax that is administered as a direct payment instead of a tax deduction like it is in Denmark. This extreme simplicity is unique even among the Nordics. Norway, Finland, and Sweden all have deductions, though, of course, not nearly as many as the US, with our rat's nest of tax loopholes. As of 2022, the Treasury Department counts up 165 tax expenditures, a big reason why the American tax code takes up something like 2,600 pages. The Faroese code could be printed on a fancy restaurant menu. Remarkably, nobody I spoke with was quite sure how and why the tax system developed. Ayun said it was developed in 1984 with help from the Danish government, but wasn't sure why. Joni Hjulgaard, an advisor at the Ministry of Finance, speculated that one possible reason Denmark didn't adopt it was because at the time, it already had a world-class tax system, while the Faroes did not. My sense is that tax was only a modest improvement back in the 80s, but with the rise of computer technology and the internet, its clean foundation allowed it to improve greatly. Other European and Asian countries have tax authorities that calculate your tax liability for you each year, and thus require little more than an annual check-in for normal employees. That's far better than how the IRS works in the US, outsourcing much of the bureaucracy to ordinary citizens. But tax is a substantial upgrade even from the world's most efficient and hassle-free tax systems, which provides several immediate advantages. First, because it monitors every income stream for each individual and it does it continuously instead of once a year, it can automatically adjust tax withholding on the fly and almost always hits the correct figure. When the year is over, almost everybody ends up with, "Oh, it's correct, I don't have to pay any more and I don't get any money back," said Ayun. Continuous collection also eliminates the time risk of the government losing out on tax payments if companies go bankrupt before tax could cash their checks. Second, nearly all government benefit payments are consolidated and partly automated. Instead of welfare agencies having to maintain their own payment systems, like how each American state maintains a separate unemployment bureaucracy, many of which are severely dysfunctional, the government simply tells tax who is eligible for what program, and the payments are rolled into the daily distribution. Third, most of the burden of payroll processing is removed from employers. Business, they are very happy about this, Ayun told me. They don't have to do anything else. They don't have to transfer some money to the tax authorities or some pensions or the other funds, nothing. It's all done at the same time. Fourth, tax's requirement that everything happens through their bank-centered system both greatly simplifies their administrative tasks and ensures that virtually every person has a bank account. It's impossible to get any money from the government if you don't have a bank account. Nothing is paid out through a check. It doesn't exist, said Ayun. Partly because of that requirement, plain vanilla bank accounts take only a few minutes to obtain for any native Faroese, or just a bit longer for any immigrant so long as they have a job. In America, by contrast, there are an estimated 6 million unbanked people who rely on payday lenders or other financial predators for simple access to the payment system, and about 7% of adults don't have internet access and so couldn't use any tax-style automated customer service tools. Fifth, the Economic Data Agency Statistics Faroe Islands has access to data of unparalleled quality and timeliness. The tax system is a big source for Faroese statistics, Hogni Wilhelm, an agency statistician, told me. We collect all taxes and income in microdata, which they use to publish regular analyses of economic trends. By way of comparison, U.S. agencies typically rely on surveys for these purposes. The Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, for instance, maintain the Current Population Survey, which contacts about 60,000 households monthly to interview them about their jobs, income, and other questions. The results are then demographically adjusted such that they represent the whole American population to create macroeconomic figures. BLS statisticians are as smart as they come, but this process is both cumbersome and potentially wrong. Initial estimates are adjusted after initial publication and are frequently found to be inaccurate. The Faroese Tax Authority, by contrast, publishes unemployment and income figures that are as close to a literal representation of the national economy as could be imagined, with every single official job and what it actually pays down to the krona included. And because the vast majority of the data is collected automatically, this comprehensive data is actually easier to collect than surveys. At time of recording, the most recent unemployment report found there were exactly 320 full-time unemployed Faroese. Other Nordics also use tax administrative data for their national statistics, but they aren't as timely as the Faroes. The IRS does have administrative data based on tax returns, but very few institutions are allowed access to them, and they are far less accurate thanks to rampant tax avoidance and errors. On its face, an ultra-efficient tax authority doesn't seem like an especially Nordic-style project in the usual tradition of strong labor unions, generous welfare states, and so on, though the Faroes do have those things as well. It might even be considered somewhat conservative. The Tax Foundation, for instance, is constantly complaining about the onerous burden created by America's ultra-complicated tax code. Before he quit politics, Paul Ryan used to talk about how great it would be to file your taxes on a postcard, though he did nothing of the sort with his signature policy accomplishment, the 2017 Trump tax cuts. But Republicans are totally uninterested in the kinds of investment necessary to make taxes easy. On the contrary, they have a long history of hating taxation as such, both cutting the tax rate, especially on rich people, and cutting the IRS budget as well so it can't undergo the expensive audits necessary to collect what the rich legally owe. When Republicans took control of the House in 2010, they steadily cut down the agency's budget. Between that year and 2020, the IRS budget fell by 20% adjusted for inflation, while the number of returns it received increased by 19%. By 2021, the IRS was near a state of collapse. There is no way to sugarcoat the year 2021 in tax administration. From the perspective of tens of millions of taxpayers, it was horrendous, said a report from the agency's Taxpayer Advocate Service, which cataloged tens of millions of delays in return and refund processing. This was due in part to a big backlog of unprocessed returns from the previous 2 years, the worst phone service in IRS history, a glacially slow response to IRS requests for corrections, and on and on. Then, because the agency is barely keeping on top of immediate tasks, it has no leftover money to upgrade its increasingly ancient systems. The 2 IRS systems containing the official records of individual and business taxpayer accounts are the oldest major technology systems in the federal government, notes the report. Importantly, this only leads to more spending over the long term. When the IRS is forced to cheap out on investment, it eventually ends up spending much more over time to maintain crumbling and outdated equipment. Other problems lie outside the agency, however. The IRS still spends billions laboriously processing paper returns by hand and sending out paper checks. But it couldn't impose an online-only requirement without help from Congress to get universal access to bank accounts and the internet. Now, under the Biden administration, Democrats passed an additional $80 billion for the IRS over the next decade. Sure enough, during the 2022 and 2023 tax filing seasons, responsiveness greatly improved. But the agency was barely started on fixing its long-term problems when Republicans won control of the House in 2022 and immediately started clawing back the extra funding through continuing budget resolutions. Since Trump won the election in 2024, things have gotten much worse. Republicans have clawed back almost all the remaining IRS funding, and Elon Musk's Doge goons have illegally fired tens of thousands of IRS employees. As a result, something like $500 billion in legally owed tax will not be collected this year, and it will probably get worse in the future as Doge is planning to completely shut down the IRS department in charge of auditing rich people, like, for example, Elon Musk. Even if Democrats win power back in 2028, it will take years for the agency just to dig itself out from its current hole, much less to begin modernizing its procedures. With all that terrible American history, I was a little alarmed when Ayun and Diana started talking about the tax budget. It all sounded a little familiar. I have a slide here. I love to show it, Ayun told me. This one is how much we cost to finance our work here. In 2012, we cost $72.8 million. This year, we cost $70.5 million, less than we did 10 years ago. And the economy has grown a lot since. Sounds a little bit like Paul Ryan. As I listened to Ayun, however, it became clear that the implications of his austere budgeting were not remotely what they would be in America. In fact, they were the exact opposite. I realized that the greatest benefit of how the Faroes had set up their tax system had to do with the tax agency itself. The need for workers at tax has been gradually cut back by careful automation of routine procedures, while the remaining staffers have focused even more on auditing rich people and companies. Indeed, that's one reason for the efficiency upgrades, so that it can plow some of the savings into audits. Big companies are consuming quite a lot of energy in-house. We don't want to skip that, Diana said. Ayun, he really wants to make that more intensive. But that's why we want IT to be better. He wants to take the resources and put it into the controlling department. Instead of the tax budget being randomly hacked away by an extremist party with an ideological hatred of taxation, staff had been cut back only when doing so would not reduce the accuracy of tax collection. On the contrary, collections from audits have increased over time. In 2015, it collected about 16 million kroner, while in 2021, we did correction for 250 million kroner, and that's mostly businesses, Hyun told me with a hint of pride. Meanwhile, the broader economic context changes the implications of streamlining the tax system. The rest of the Faroese economy is so red hot and desperate for workers that cutting back on tax, staffing, and budget materially helps everyone by freeing up resources and workers. I have told all the people here that in 10 years we are going to be less than 100 because we have to be more efficient, Hyun told me. And I think it's the right way to do because of the tax authority, we have to be as efficient as possible, so cheap as possible, so we can have more money or more staff at the hospital, taking care of the elderly, things like that. Visiting the Faroes, I learned a whole new way that America is a humiliating international laggard. Our tax system is about the worst of all possible worlds. Expensive, ultra-complicated, inefficient, slow, inaccurate, wildly unfair, and an enormous headache for the citizenry. After returning to the States and thinking it over for a time, I've concluded that tax would not have been built without the broader context of Nordic social democracy. Ideologically, the absence of deductions and butter-smooth tax payment process reflects a profound acceptance of government, especially stiff taxation that is radically at odds with American ways of thinking. We are addicted to tax deductions, credits, and exemptions because this style of policy allows their recipients to pretend as if they are rugged individualists who don't depend on government help, and if taxes are a species of theft. The habit is so deeply ingrained that even when Democrats were passing major climate policy in the Inflation Reduction Act, nearly the entire energy investment program was camouflaged as a tax benefit, in the process adding even more paperwork headaches for the beleaguered IRS. Now, that is not to say that the Faroes don't have a conservative side. On the contrary, the conservative coalition won the 2019 election, and upon taking power, scrapped an auction system for fishing permits the prior leftist government had set up. That said, the Social Democratic Party won the following elections in 2022. But, in any case, the contest between right and left takes place between political goalposts that might as well be on a different planet from the US. So, it's probably out of the question to think we could simply copy-paste the tax system into America. But we could still learn from their example. We might not be able to scrap every deduction in the tax code or have every payment routed through a central system, but we could build an opt-in system for anyone who dislikes paperwork. And we could have a cheaper IRS with fewer staff that handled most tax returns automatically if we cared to follow the Faroese example of careful, long-term investment in computers and automation. Tax day could be a lot easier in this country if we cared about it. I'm sure Director Mokura would be happy to explain to any IRS official how he's done it. Just remember to bring a rain jacket. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, we'd be much obliged if you could subscribe to the channel, recommend it to your friends, and most of all, head on over to prospect.org to see more great reporting on money, politics, and power. We'd also like to thank the People's Policy Project for providing funding to support my reporting trip to the Faroes. See you next time.